Welcome to the November Subscribers Town Hall. This time I'll be your host, Tyler Whitkin, Community Manager in the Austin, Texas studio. And joining me is a man who really doesn't need an introduction, but we're going to do one anyway. Director of Persistent Universe, Tony Zervik. How are you doing, Tony?
Pretty good.
Awesome. Good to hear. So I appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to come hang out with all of us. It means a lot to me, and I know it means a lot to everybody else. So we've had you on here a few times, so you kind of know what's going on. But just in case anybody viewing has no idea what's going on, this is our monthly town hall made possible by our subscribers, where we take questions live from two different channels. One of those channels being a forum thread that we posted last week where we gathered questions throughout the week. And I have to take a moment to say, fantastic work. The questions that came in this time were unbelievably good. So you're going to have a little bit of pressure today. We're going to ask some of these tough questions, and lengthy ones too, very verbose. And the other channel is from our website. We have a chat room on our website. If you head over to robertspaceindustries.com, make sure you're logged in, click on community, then click on chat. Make sure you are in the subscribers tab. Preface your question with the word question in brackets, and there's no need to repeat your question because we have auto scroll disabled, so we miss nothing. So let's go ahead and kick things off. In case anybody's been living under a rock, Tony, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do for Star Citizen?
So, as Tyler said, Tony Zervik, Director of Persistent Universe, and right now I would say a lot of the focus is basically on the artificial intelligence, on the mission creation system, on setting up, the back end for the economy to tie into all the shops that are already out there, but they're not, behaving in an economically accurate way yet. We're still, very focused upon, what the upcoming environments and stuff they're going to be exposed to the players are going to be, and just a variety of things like that.
Okay, so it's Director of the Persistent Universe, Director of Persistent Universe. It's kind of like a design director overseeing a lot of the design, yeah.
Yeah, it's actually a little bit broader. Like, we've got a dedicated design director as well.
Okay, top heavy.
Yeah, top heavy.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, let's waste no time at all. Go ahead and get your questions flowing into the subscribers chat. You guys have some competition, though, because like I said earlier, the questions on the forums, I printed them out. They're on point. So let's go ahead and kick things off with the first question. What do you envision interactions with non-mission NPCs will be like? Someone who's just passing on the street, or just backdrop characters in a bar? Or will they say the same things over and over, not respond, generate a possible mission, hook, lore, things on the fly appropriate for that character?
Yeah, most of the landing zones, or at least many of the landing zones, will have a fairly large complement of what I'd call background NPCs, and these are just the guys that are, making the world, seem believable, seem realistic, but they don't really play, a critical role in terms of, sending you to do a particular mission, or whatever the case may be. These NPCs will all have their own dedicated 24-hour schedules. They've got, their own life that they want to lead, and as such, they're not particularly interested in, dealing too much with just, a guy that they meet on the street. So a lot of the interaction that you have with them will tend to be, very brief. It'll tend to be very, very reactionary. What I mean by this is, if you pass them on the street, then they may, focus on you for a split second, acknowledge, your existence. They may, mutter something to you, hey, how's it going, etc. They may just give you, a subtle little head acknowledgement. If you're in a bar and you're behaving obnoxiously or loud, then they may mutter something about you under their breath. They may put a little bit of distance between you and them. Similarly, if you're, just behaving in an erratic fashion, you're dancing right next to them, but you're nowhere near the actual, dance floor, then they would do what you would expect, people do in real life, which is to just, to basically just, increase the distance between you and them. So I think that a lot of what these characters do is really going to be, more in the mode of generating atmosphere. They will certainly engage in a lot of conversation, particularly with one another. And in that regard, there will be a lot of shared conversational logic. But a lot of that logic will also have branching even amongst themselves, so that even though you might have a particular character talking about, how he hurt his knee, the source of how he actually injured it, or what type
of Skyrim reference.
Well, yeah,
To take an arrow to the knee.
and then so whether or not the character with whom he's talking expresses sympathy, or they admonish him for being reckless, or whatever the case may be, you'll have a lot of variability in that. And so certainly we're going to wind up, borrowing some assets, because there's only so much you can do. But we've got, a lot of, I would say tricks up our sleeves, such that we can make it appear, much more unique than it really is.
And alive, yeah, awesome. So another one, can you describe the preliminary idea for how the interdiction mechanic will work and how to escape them?
Yeah, I can't go into too much detail yet about how exactly you're going to escape them, since that's a problem that's still being figured out right now. I can give a little bit of background as to why we add the devices in the first place and what our current thinking is on them. An interdiction device is basically something that allows players or NPCs to pull one another out of quantum travel mode, and as such, we expect these to be very popular with pirates that are looking to, say, pull a freighter that's loaded with valuable ore off of the quantum highway far away from UE security forces, so that they can basically extract all those valuables and go sell on the black market or something. These interdiction devices are going to have one of the problems when we set upon basically creating these things was where exactly we wanted to eject you once you've been caught in the so-called spider's web. And so at first we were thinking, well, we'll bring you out right in close proximity, and that way you're immediately engaged with the person.
Will ensue, yeah.
That's exactly it. The problem with that is assuming you're a freighter and you actually need some assistance, and you employ your service beacon, which we've talked about before, to basically call some mercenaries to come to your aid. By the time those other players and NPCs show up, you're probably already dead. So then we started looking at it the other way. It's like, well, we'll basically just increase the amount of distance. So we'll pull you out of quantum travel mode, but we'll put 5 or 10 miles between you, and they'll have to close that distance before they can actually engage. So you've got a little bit of time to call in the reinforcements. The problem with that was that then a lot of players, once they got pulled out of quantum travel mode, they would just respool their engines back up, and within the course of whatever it takes, 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, they'll jump back out before the distance has been closed. And so we wound up settling upon an area of effect mechanic where the person that actually initiates the interdiction field will have the ability to dictate how much, what the amount of power that's being consumed, which will ultimately determine what the range of the interdiction device is, and also the shape of the curve. The shape of the curve will basically dictate the probability where you'll actually fall. In other words, you won't always fall at the center, you won't always fall at the fringe, but it will be based probabilistically based upon the shape of that curve. And so as you basically push that curve farther in, you're more likely to have people fall in that area. However, that also means that they can re-engage their quantum engines at a much less significant significant distance. So of course the person that actually initiates these things is going to be trying to figure out what the sweet spot is given the area they're in as to how they want to tune these devices. The other thing is that you don't want to just necessarily crank them up to maximum power, because interdiction devices are frowned upon, obviously, by by the law and order society, and therefore, as soon as you flip one of these things on, you become a target not just for UE security forces, but for anybody that's making for any player that's aiming to make a quick buck by eradicating these things, and they'll get paid for every single one that they take out. So you either need to be operating these things out on the fringes, or you need to be doing it for very brief periods of time, or potentially just bringing in the area of effect to a very localized area, which means you're gonna catch less flies, and they're going to be able to escape your web more easily because it's so localized, but you're therefore much less likely to be detected.
Awesome. Let me just tell you that I just love having you on this show. You make my job so easy. You just take it. I love it. So you mentioned distance. One of the things I was thinking about when you were talking about that is currently in Alpha 2.5, when you quantum travel, they're very, very short distances. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of time to be able to implement like an interdiction mechanic. So with 3.0 and looking forward, the quantum travel distance is going to be much longer.
Yeah, we've got the solar system is fairly compressed in terms of the points of interest right now. This will change, fairly significantly as we start to get to 3.0, and we get all the planets, in the proper positions, and we start to basically distribute space stations, not just, in the center of the solar system, but actually out on the fringes, and we start to introduce all these other areas. And so all of a sudden, you're going to have the potential for considerably longer transit time.
Actually, I'm remembering now from the Gamescom demo when they used their quantum drive from Port Olisar to Levski, it was significantly longer than anything in 2.5. So do you think that that's a little more representative of maybe what we will see?
Yeah, there's still the ability to tune a lot of this, because I think it's pretty common knowledge. Like, well, we've artificially shrunk the solar system to, it varies depending upon how you're measuring the scale, but to roughly 10% of what an actual
I've seen
solar
on
system
Reddit and our forums, people did the math. They were like trying to calculate everything, timing out. Yeah,
but then again, you don't actually travel at light speed. We haven't figured out exactly how quickly we'll allow different ships to go, and there will be some variance between the ships. But in general, we kind of lean towards somewhere between 20%, 30, 35%, the speed of light. And so even in a compressed solar system, you're still talking about several dozens of minutes to basically cross from one end to the other. And so even if you're on going from a planet to another planet, that could very easily be, once we've got everything set up properly, that could very easily be multiple minutes, 3, 4, 5 minutes of quantum travel.
Awesome. So let's go ahead and take one of these questions from the live chat. I could read these forum ones. They're so good. Let's see here. Will NPCs remember us between visits? If we carry on a conversation with a bartender, is it possible that they would remember us if we visit again another day or another week?
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually fundamental to the whole AI system, is the ability for them to retain experiences. And I don't want to go into it too much, but probably once we get 3.0 out the door, I'll go into more detail about how we basically plan to allow these algorithmically created NPCs to all of a sudden become a persistent character for the purpose of your own personal adventures and stuff.
Yeah, you make your reputation, earn your name.
Yeah, again, it's an extended conversation that'll kind of distract us from this. But in the case of NPCs remembering you, yes, and they can do that on multiple levels. Some NPCs will have the knowledge of what organization you're a member of, and they can respond differently depending upon whether or not they like or dislike that organization. They may have had personal dealings with you in the past. You may have taken a mission from them, and maybe you stiffed them. Maybe you actually did a fantastic job. Maybe you did a poor job, etc. And so there's actually a variety of different metrics by which they'll keep track of their relationship with you, and all of these are available inside the conversational logic, such that depending upon the character, they can respond in whatever manner that the designer that set that particular NPC up thinks is appropriate.
That's badass. So let's take another question from the forums here. Have CIG made plans to give players incentives to keep playing Star Citizen? And I think this one was a bit longer, but it's basically we don't have a progressive leveling system. So what will keep people playing the game?
Yeah, well, this one to me, the obvious answer is, of course, well, you're always going to be trying to get the better ship, and you're going to try to equip it. You're going to try to customize your character, and you're going to basically compete against and cooperate with other players. And so all of this is true in terms of it's certainly going to provide some motivation to keep going within the game. But to me personally, the thing that is really going to differentiate the game the most, that's really going to basically pull you back in and keep you coming back for more, is the ability to experience new things. And this is going to involve everything from reaching a city that you've never seen before, to seeing new AI behaviors, to coming up against new challenges and overcoming them. And this is why we're so adamant about the approach that we've taken, which is that the modular and procedural technologies that we've developed are just a tool that aids in the creation, of the content, and they're not intended to act as a substitute for that creation process. And the reason is because we believe that each place that you get to, each critical key NPC that you interact with, they should actually be distinct and unique and have their own backstory. And if you're talking about a city, it should actually have its own fiction, and it should look, it should basically look unique versus the other ones that you've experienced. And that's very difficult to do when you're talking about, doing something entirely procedurally or algorithmically. There tends to be a formula that's not usually that hard to pick up. You tend to get a lot of sameness, in terms of your output. And so for us, those are extremely useful tools to have, but we still want artists and designers actually building the world and actually scripting the NPCs and actually determining what's going to be of interest. And therefore, you as a player, when you reach this, when you reach that, that location you haven't yet been to, that there's been a tremendous amount of effort invested into making all of that stuff an interesting place to visit, and it's going to have its own dedicated challenges if you choose to accept them. And this ultimately is, I think, what's going to keep players coming back for more, because the idea is that the game is never going to become just more of the same. The idea is that as you push farther, as you get farther, you will experience more, you will see more. And I think ultimately that's something, that's going to basically add a lot of longevity to the game's life.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I haven't played a game that didn't follow that same leveling system, so that sounds awesome.
Yeah, well, it's just to add one more detail. It's why we're also there's so many of these systems, whether it's subsumption or whatever, to where we're developing everything in a very systematic fashion. And the reason for that is that we wind up getting a lot of benefit from setting the system up, and then we just customize it as appropriate, and all the background detail gets filled in. It's a good example would just be the procedural planet demo, to where you tweak parameters, and it's like, well, you want an ice planet. I want, I want incredible snowstorms over here, and I want desert over here, and I want forest over here.
It was really cool seeing the tools they were using too. They could just draw on the terrain.
And then after you've got that background, you come in and now I'm going to customize. I'm going to put this city here, and then you start adding all the detail and the NPCs and the conversations and the missions and the challenges and all that type of stuff gets layered on top of there. And it's going to be. The only reason it's possible is because we've basically taken this this long road approach to so many of these pieces of the technology, instead of just trying to basically get these things out the door in whatever manner possible, which usually involves a lot of sacrifices, a lot of simplifications in terms of the technology. That would ultimately cause problems down the road. It's kind of akin, like one of the analogies I always use is, you're trying to build a skyscraper. You need to know that you're building a skyscraper at the very beginning, and that's going to affect how deep you go when you're laying your foundation. It's going to basically dictate what types of beams you're using. It's going to dictate loads of stuff. You can't start out building a 2-story house and then halfway through construction figure out that it's going to be an 80-story skyscraper. It will collapse under its own weight. And so from the very beginning, the mandate has been, let's basically design this thing for the long term, for a decade-long run, and at the same time, we know that we're going to need just an astronomical quantity of content in order to keep players occupied. So how do we go about accomplishing that? And you see that in so many different areas of the game, to where you're aiming to do things the long way, the proper way. You're aiming to lay the foundation before you really start getting to the details, and it can be frustrating because it means there's a whole lot of infrastructure that needs to be built before you actually start adding some of those details.
Yeah, a lot of it's trekking new ground. We're doing things that are untraditional. Even things about how the camera works, so it's attached to a character. There's a million examples of that where we're kind of going down a path that hasn't been gone down very often, but that's exciting, it's innovative, and ultimately it'll lead to a pretty epic experience. So let's see what else we got here. This one's a bit of a mouthful, but he sounds like he knows what he's talking about, so we're gonna do this. You previously mentioned a puzzle-style mission system where each piece of the puzzle is custom handcrafted, possibly combined with logical generic missions like destroy pirates at waypoint A and fed into the system. The more puzzle pieces you feed it, the more complex and intricate the system would automatically create based on many variables fed into it, such as the galactic economy system. They would fit together based on developer-specified hooks, so you wouldn't end up with a meaningless mission chain like find missing cargo, uncover pirates, fetch box of wine. Is this still the current plan? If so, how is this going? If not, what replaced it? And will we see only very early aspects of it in 3.0, or is it still in the early days for something this dynamic? Thank you, Sausage Carius.
Yeah, this one, it actually sounds more complicated. The concept is actually fairly straightforward. It's very much still the plan. This is actually something I'm actively working on.
I'm glad you got the question.
Basically, this pertains to the fact that we're really going to have two types of mission content, two types of experiences within the game. There are going to be the experiences, the missions that a designer has gone in and he's handcrafted, and basically this NPC says this, and he's going to send you over here, and we're basically going to have these ships up here, and it's like a miniature Squadron 42 story, so to speak, where everything's kind of set up a particular way, and there can be some variability in there, but in general, this is the way they want that mission to flow and how they want it to work. Those types of things, on the one hand, they're fantastic experiences. On the other hand, once you've done once you've done this particular mission, there's practically no replay value. So they tend to be very expensive and of very limited use after you've done it once. All that motion, all that dedicated motion capture, or all that conversation logic, or all that mission hookup that you did, it's of no benefit to anything else. So one of the things that I wanted to basically address was the fact that we were only going to be able to create content to that degree at a certain rate of speed. And so the question becomes, well, what about all the systematic content that we're going to create to where I'm just flying around, and because there's a refinery here and there's an asteroid field here, you should see a bunch of freighters carrying ore back and forth. How do we actually make that interesting? In other words, imagine you see or you hear a freighter, and this is an example I've used before, but I'll use it again here for in case some people haven't seen or heard it. Imagine you've got a freighter and it puts out a distress call, and so you accept the mission on your service beacon, you head on over there to help him out, you blow up, you kill the pirates that were in the process of boarding his ship. And for a lot of players, that's literally it. And so we could create very many of these types of little scenarios, pirate under distress, or freighter under distress, space station that's about to be pulverized by asteroids, etc. But they're fairly shallow in terms of the amount of depth. In other words, if you start adding depth, then they start looking like a typical, very labor-intensive mission to create. With this follows this, and there's this sense of context, and there's this sense of elevation of danger and reward towards the latter stages of that mission, etc. And so what we really wanted is a system to where we can build all of the component pieces and then algorithmically string them together, at least in enough fashion so that these things start to become much more interesting than they would otherwise be in and of themselves, and yet they're not dramatically blowing up the amount of labor that the designers have to invest to make them work. And so to continue with the example, you've got a distress call, you go over, you basically fight off the pirates, and the freighter captain thanks you, and he gives you $1,000 for your efforts. And for many players, that's it, and they basically get back into their ship and they head off in the other direction. They continue with what they were doing. Other players, however, may tug on that virtual mission thread a little bit by going onto the pirate ship, that they just overcame, and they search the computer and they find a little bit of intel. And that intel is effectively a key. You've got a chunk of information which came from a pirate ship. So now you can consult your mission database and find, well, what do I have that's compatible with a chunk of information? And I don't know what that information is yet, and it was found in a pirate ship. And it goes and it can look in the mission database and figure out, well, I could have that information relate to the location of the secret pirate base. Okay, so now that it's And now that information has solidified and taken form, it's now the location of the secret pirate base. Well, you can basically follow that thread, go to that pirate base, sneak in, attack it, do whatever, and maybe if you kill all the guards, the leader of that thing will actually, you can interrogate him, and he'll actually tell you the location of a pirate warlord that's currently holding a political hostage for ransom, and then you can basically go over there, you can save that person and get money. And so the point is, we won't be able to algorithmically string too many of these things together before it just starts looking a little bit, before it starts looking algorithmic and erratic. But the goal is that we should be able to string at least 2 or 3 or 4 of these things, together very easily, so that you maintain, like I said, context and difficulty and an elevation, in terms of what you're trying to do, such that it's going to make all the background incidentals that are going on in the universe look way more interesting than they would otherwise be. In other words, now when you come upon someone and they're, you don't really know where that thread is going to be. I could pull it and it takes me off in this direction. You could have a similar distress call and you kind of like pull it and it takes you in a totally different direction. And the key thing is that these so-called these missions, these adventures, whatever you want to call them, they're basically formulated from little abstracted blocks of logic and data. So many people have obviously heard of the concept of object-oriented programming. This is really taking that same concept and applying it to the creation of content, which is actually how I refer to it internally, which is object-oriented content creation. And so little chunks of this abstracted mission logic, they have inputs, they have outputs, they type what they need very specifically, so that you can tie them into other things as appropriate and wind up getting something that is more, that's longer and more interesting and provides, a little bit more, extensive play experience than the simpler stuff that
absolutely not as linear for sure.
Yep.
Actually, I'm going to skip ahead. There's one question that I wanted to ask that kind of followed that up, which is this one right here. I was wondering if you have been able to solve the problem with quests and quest givers on the PU, where a large number of people may want to obtain a quest from a particular quest giver or to go to a particular area to carry out the quest. How do you prevent people from griefing or piling up on the guest NPCs? And honestly, just to preface that, it sounds like everything you just said kind of fits into this, because it's really going to disperse.
Well, there's no one answer to this question. The reality is we're trying to veer away from the instancing and go to one big contiguous world, and every player is in the same world. And that does come with some limitations in terms of it means that there's only one Tyler. And so if I want to talk to Tyler, then someone else needs to wait. And so there are a variety of ways by which we, aim to address this, and as with a lot of things, we'll have to, tune it based upon, what winds up happening when we release the first iterations of these solutions out in the wild and see, how the community responds and how well the solution actually works. By that I mean some things like if you're doing cargo transport, you may be going to a TDD, and you tend to utilize kiosks to basically accept your missions there. And would they have any number of kiosks, so you don't really have everybody getting routed through through just a single character. In other places, you will have a single character, and will basically make it less likely to result in a bottleneck by having a good variety of characters. In other words, if you go to a landing zone and there's only one guy and he's the designated mission giver, then every player in that area is going to be going to that same guy.
And I've seen that in MMOs where you see, like, right on launch day, right, a new expansion or a new game comes out, there's the massive crowd of players that are just like, all right, first quest. And they're just moving like a concert crowd from quest to quest to quest.
Yeah, so it doesn't fix the whole problem, but if you've got at a given landing zone, if you've got 4 or 5 or 6 different people, then you're going to distribute your player base, at least to some degree. Then additionally, you've got things like, I think the guy mentioned, the potential for griefing. How do you basically prevent one player from just constantly talking to that guy? And I would do the same thing that you do in the real world. Like, imagine you've got a scene in The Godfather, and you get some guy and he comes off the street and he goes up to Marlon Brando, and basically he asks him a question, Marlon Brando, answers him, and then he just asks him, another question, and then he just keeps there. Now, eventually Marlon Brando
just poking him.
Eventually he's going to signal to his guys, and they're going to basically kick him back out on the street. He's like, that's it. I don't want to talk to you again for a day or a week or whatever. And so The point is, NPCs will obviously need the ability to detect things like this guy keeps talking to me, but the conversation's going nowhere. Therefore, I'm going to stop responding to this, to this guy, to where you'll try to talk to him and he just grunts and he basically looks away. Now, another player that's viewed more favorably comes up and tries to engage that same guy in conversation. He's like, oh well, I'll go ahead and talk to you.
This guy's been bugging me for 20 minutes
because this guy's really annoying, and so. There are still more. I've mentioned a few here, but there are another several. And so what we're hoping is that we basically attack this problem on multiple different fronts, and it winds up minimizing the problem such that there's no guarantee, just like in the real world. If I go to talk to a particular guy, I may actually have to, to wait, especially if he's particularly important. But that's really no different than you do in the real world. And as long as I've got lots of other opportunities, and you don't run into that type of bottleneck, situation too often, then I think that the advantages you get from having one contiguous world will dramatically outweigh, those the costs that you pay in terms of things like that. So that's
I like that. It's the same like for holiday shopping. If you wanted to go to like a Target or a Walmart or something to go shopping, if there was only one of them, the line would be wrapped around the building 5 times.
Well, the other thing is, I don't think any player would like the concept of a queue, but if it's done in fiction and if the lines aren't too long, then all of a sudden it starts to become a little bit more tolerable. And again, to just expand on the Godfather analogy there, it's like, well, the key character's in a back room. You don't have direct access. You have to go through his henchmen who control the door. So you go talk to them. They're like, okay, I'll call you when basically he's ready to see you, which is again pretty much how you would expect it to work. If it's a really critical figure, I probably can't just walk right in off the street and go see him. And so the idea is, as long as I'm in there and the other guy that's currently talking to him, it's not going to take more than 2 minutes, because if it takes more than 2 minutes, something's gone wrong, that guy's screwing with him, and they're just going to kick him out. And so you're just going to get regular turnover, and it's never going to get too deep. And we've basically backed up why you're waiting and how you're waiting in a way that actually is, compatible with the fiction of the game. Then all of a sudden it just starts to become part of the overall gameplay experience.
No, I like it. As long as like the line for the next gen Moby Glass doesn't look like the line for the next gen iPhone in real life. Yeah, because that would be too much.
The problems with these situations come when, if you've ever got, 45 players lined up, that's a problem. If you've ever got, a player in there and he sits with that critical NPC for 15 minutes, that's a problem. But those are things that are very easily resolved. And so the question mark becomes, once we employ all of these different mechanics, how much of a problem will still remain, and what will the community's reaction be? And so again, we kind of need to put the solution out into the wild, let people try it, and then we'll refine it as necessary, which is obviously what we do with a lot
iteration
of
that we always talk about. Awesome. All right, let's jump on another question. So, will cities be mostly filler to be viewed when flying past, with players restricted to only specific play areas, or will players have the ability to freely explore throughout entire cities? If players are restricted to specific areas, do you see those restrictions being done away with at some point in the future as additional dev tools become available?
I don't see them. Well, actually, I guess I should qualify this. Like, for example, in Area 18, the original idea was that there were going to be 3 sections of the city. You've actually had only 2 available for a while. I suspect at some point we'll unveil the last chunk. So there will be some expansion of some of these cities that that you've already seen, or even that are upcoming. We won't release 100% of them on day one. Now, that said, are we ever going to aim to do just a big gargantuan 20 square mile city? And the answer to that is no. And the reason is because that's a totally different type of game. If you start to think about the gameplay experience on those larger cities, what you tend to get is a lot of repetition. Like, for example, there's only going to be so many different types of shops. So once you've got access to a gun shop and a clothing shop, then what would you have, to populate, 4 streets down, 8 streets down, 12 streets down? Well, it would be a different gun shop, and it would be a different clothing store. Where for me it becomes more interesting is, rather than duplicating all those things and just changing the inventory, maybe tweaking the prices and stuff like that, I'd rather give you a completely different experience, such that you go to Area 18 and it looks like this, and you've got access, and everything's kind of been artificially compressed so that the points of interest are all, within walking distance. And then you go to Alevsky, and basically it's been, compressed so that all of the points of interest, are, over the course of, a few different floors, but the same basic idea. And that to me is a lot more interesting than a city that just goes and goes and goes and goes.
Or it just feels like a pattern, tiled texture.
Yeah, my point with Levski versus Area 18 is Levski looks dramatically different than Area 18. I think there's a tremendous amount of value in that, to where, well, I go to one, it feels like this, and this is how, and at night, Area 18 is not too dangerous unless you're over in the construction area. And in Levski, it gets extraordinarily dangerous day or night once you start to wander away from the safe, secure, central bazaar area and start to go back into the tunnels and stuff. Mm-hmm. Then you've got all manner of criminals and illicit operations going on back there. The point is, it's a totally different experience. So if you had to pick, because again, you've only got so much bandwidth that you've got to devote to solving these problems. Would you rather have a totally different chunk of gameplay, or would you rather have just a slight variation in terms of which clothes are available and what the prices are? The other thing is, like, imagine Levski, you would expect the prices to be dramatically different because it's going to be in a different area of the solar system. It's going to be closer to this manufacturing facility. It's going to be farther away from this, from this refinery. Therefore, you would expect to see different missions available there. You would expect to see a different type of clothing given the different, political environment. So to me, it kind of goes back to what I was saying before, which is every place you get to, it's an experience in and of itself. And I'd rather focus, our efforts on what makes that experience really interesting, and not basically try to figure that out for Levski and then multiply times 20 so that I cover, just a big gargantuan, number of city blocks.
And that's not to say that a planet's not going to have multiple landing zones. It's not like everything's compressed into one spot on the planet. I mean, that's one of the things we showed off the Gamescom demo, was those gateways that were right above the atmosphere, so you could traverse around the planet for different landing zones and stuff.
Yeah, the other thing too is that in general, I look at things like cities and stuff as gathering points. That's where you're going to go, and I kind of want to push the players into relatively close proximity. And if you have a big gargantuan city and got 14 weapon shops, then your player base is going to be spread all over the place, and that's just for one city. And now you replicate times X number of cities, and every once in a while you'll stumble across another player, but it's going to be a fairly, a fairly rare event. Whereas to me, it's much more interesting. It's like, well, when you're walking around the weapons shop on Area 18, you're certainly going to see other players there. And then you go over to the clothing, and you're certainly and that's where you're striking up relationships. And then those relationships lead to you guys going out on missions together and having fun together as a group. And again, this just comes back to me to where this is where you're going to get the long-term interest for the game. And so I think you need to be careful with the. I think you need to be careful, even if you have the tools and technology to, create as big a city as you want, whether or not what type of game you're trying to be would really benefit from just arbitrarily spreading it out. And in this case,
that's a challenge too. When you have the power, it's hard to hold back in order to really look at it from a bird's eye perspective and say, we want to make sure this is fun. We want to make sure that people are interacting with each other. We want to make sure that people aren't not seeing somebody for days or weeks at a time.
I'd just look forward to basically having more cities, and each city's got its own distinct feel, flavor, visuals, different NPCs. It's got totally different availability of missions and commodities and clothing and all this other stuff. So when I get to that place, I feel, yep, I'm in Levski because this is what Levski is. I'm in Area 18. This is what this is what Area 18 is. I'm in Orison. This is how Orison this is how Orison feels. And if you start doing things like, well, this is the rich part of Orison, and this is the poor part of Orison, and this is basically the high-tech part of Orison, and it's like, well, you start getting a lot of overlap between, well, wait, this city was kind of high-tech, and this is the high-tech part of Orison, and those start to kind of blur together. I'd rather save that that quantum leap in differential for a different environment where I can change more stuff as opposed to just being able to tweak some things.
Yeah, no, I really like that you mentioned the different flavor for the different towns and cities, because we were in here with Brian Brewer and David Pang, and we were talking about animations, and they were on the same page with that, where you might see in a poorer or shadier town that the characters are just a little more hunched over, a little more, you know what I mean? And so it's cool that kind of spreads out to all facets.
Well, I guess I should say that there will be a few exceptions to this rule, of course. Like for example, Terra Prime, that's a gargantuan city. It will have multiple locations to where So we may have a small number of much
Terra's
more
huge,
sprawling, expansive cities, but it won't be the norm. The norm will actually be, once we've got one gun shop, I don't see for this type of game, I don't see the benefit to having 8 different gun shops on that same planet. I'd rather put that second gun shop way out here on the fringes of the universe, and then I'm going to have an NPC that's basically touted elsewhere, in the system as being just this master weapons.
They all have their own.
And if you can get there,
you
can buy weapons you can't get anywhere else. But it's really difficult to get to there because it's basically surrounded by all sorts of illicit activity, and so you're trying to get through there. And so now you've turned it into again an entire experience, as opposed to, well, and then I went 6 blocks down and I basically found the other gun store, and they had the phased plasma rifle, which was way better. It's like what you'd really get is
every corner.
You'd get phased plasma blaster +1 here, and then you go 6 streets down and you have phased plasma blaster +2, and this one would be $100 and this one would be $110. If you want the dramatic changes, the really dramatic changes, you need to be able to justify that in terms of not just justified in terms of the game, but justified in terms of there's going to be a real economy driving this stuff.
Yeah.
So why is it in this, on the east side of the city, they've got dramatically better weapons or shielding tech or ships or whatever, and over on the west side, 5 miles away, you can't get it. It's like, you're flying around the solar system. You're telling me they can't basically move this from the west side of Orison to the east side of Orison? I mean, come on. It strains credulity.
Awesome. All right, so we have about, let's see here, 20 minutes left, so I'm gonna hop around here a little bit. Let's see. Boom, 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 boom. Will we be able to hire NPCs as crew when NPCs come into the game at first, or will that be a later addition down the road? I apologize. This is a when question, so you don't have to answer this one if you don't want to.
No, it's fine. NPCs will make their first appearance in 3.0. You definitely will not have NPC crew members. There's too much that you won't have NPC crew members in 3.0. I don't know exactly where those will fall. It kind of depends upon how a number of critical pieces of the technology where they fall into line before we could really give an accurate estimate. But it will be at least a few point releases later. For example, there are things we need. You need a personnel shop, so that you can actually hire these guys, and then you need some sort of macro level of AI logic so that they can actually figure out, well, am I happy in my job? Do I demand more money? You probably need some sort of way so that you can basically view all of your NPCs that you've got on staff, and then we need to resolve things like, well, what happens when NPC crew members die? Is there any sort of resurrection? Can you bring them back, or is that it? They're gone for good. When you lose your ship, you lose your entire NPC crew, and so there's still there's a fair bit of work, on that side. There's the actual operation. In other words, an NPC crew is of little benefit unless you've actually got one that knows how to work the gun turret and you can actually lead targets appropriately, and you've got another one, that can actually pilot quite well. The piloting would be much easier because we've already got guys that can do that. But then you're probably going to want, to have your marine contingent to basically deal with repelling, boarders, that have, gained access to your ship, and then you're going to need a way to actually give these guys commands. And so this kind of comes back again to, if you're going to do it, you want to do it right, and we want to put enough of the infrastructure in place so that version 1 is pretty enjoyable, and if not a complete experience, at least a fairly comprehensive experience in terms of how you deal with them. And there's still, as of right now, there's still too many missing pieces of the puzzle to put that in with 3.0, because 3.0 is just going to be an absolutely huge release, and there's too many other things that need to be addressed in the short term.
Awesome. That was a very good answer to a one question. I'm impressed. Will there be a hangar maximum a player can own, operate, or rent?
No, hangars are really, you'll be able to buy hangars, wherever they have hangars, and then it just becomes, a regular fee that you're paying. Don't know, like right now, we've obviously just given hangars away to anybody that buys a ship. Once the game actually goes live, it may become more, at least for the second, third, fourth hanger you get, it may be a rental thing. You may be able to just purchase them outright and not have to worry about it. It's kind of similar to cargo space, to where we've talked about allowing you at any given landing zone, assuming they offer that, to be able to just buy a chunk of storage space. And it's now, for the next month, you paid $100 and you've got the ability to store 50 SCU. And this will allow players to do things like, they saw a screamingly good deal, on copper, so they basically load it up, but now they've got to go back and get, the ship that can actually transport this much, and then come back here, so they temporarily short it. Also allow them to do things like speculation. I think copper is really cheap now, and I think a big battle's looming based upon my friend telling me that they're about to make a major assault over here, and so they're assuming that the cost that the price is going to go up, and so you just start hoarding. Of course, if there's people on the other sides going, well, we're peacekeepers, we're going to keep everything on the up and up here.
So you can hoard all the copper.
You may take a significant loss on it. Well, that's interesting. You say to take a loss. That's something we're starting to just get into, and I would say, we're starting to get quite a bit deeper into setting up all of the back-end infrastructure to tie all of the shops into the rest of the game. What I mean by that is, you can already go into Kasaba, for example, and you can buy clothing, but that clothing is not yet linked to a back-end service that provides the inventory. They've just got their own defined inventory. And so probably with 3.0, you'll see the first iteration of, it's going to look, from a player's perspective, it's going to look very similar, and yet behind the scenes, it's actually going to be dramatically different in terms of what's happening, in terms of there will be a back-end service, and it will basically dictate what Kasaba Outlet's inventory is, and when transactions are made in Kasaba Outlet, those those changes in inventory will be communicated to the, to that back-end, and that back-end service is basically the gateway over to the simulation side of the game, to where you're mimicking the effects of 90% of the population supposedly being NPCs, and what are they doing, and the player results are just being factored right back into that. And so all of a sudden, what this is going to lead to, not with 3.0, but probably in one of the point releases not too far after, is you'll start to get things like variable prices, and if there's a spike in demand for this, then all of a sudden the price will go up. The quantity, if you cut off the supply of cloth from reaching this manufacturing site, then all of a sudden clothes will be in much shorter supply. And so you'll start to see the first bits and pieces of that stuff starting to come to life. And the infrastructure will start arriving with 3.0. The actual noticeable effects will probably be more like a 3.2, 3.3 type of thing.
Awesome. That's very cool. So this question I actually really like. This was on the front page of our Star Citizen subreddit for a while. People were really excited about the Galactic Tour videos. So here's a good question. I really like the whole theme from the anniversary live stream with Galactic Tour and Jax McCleary. Will Galactic Tour be an in-game TV show? It could be a possible way to reveal new ships when the game is released, and possibly a ship show, kind of like our auto shows, where we could attend to see all the new ships and concepts from each manufacturer. Thank you, Tony, and keep up the great work.
Yeah, well, that's like a game I worked on before, Crusader. We actually had, the whole fictional news thing within the game that kind of reflected what you were actually doing within the game. And I had basically, pulled that from, back in the '80s RoboCop, which kind of did this, which kind of did the same thing.
Yeah.
And so I love that type of device, to where as you're going around, whether it's watching a movie, playing a game, whatever, to where the news is kind of giving you some sort of narrative, and basically giving you additional information as to what's going on, and what might be of interest to you, etc. In RoboCop, they did it for more for humorous purposes. In Crusader, I did it for narrative purposes. In Star Citizen, I think it could be both of those, but also because it's just incredibly useful in terms of what do you want to do now. For example, there's a big there's a big battle between the forces of Law and Order and pirates on the outskirts of the solar system. As I'm walking around Area 18, it'd be really cool if that the fact that there was such a battle was actually being reflected upon the newscast. And then you go check the job board and you're like, yep, sure enough, they're looking for tons of mercenaries to go out, and do this. And then, like you said, there would also be other ones that's like, hey, here's a new ship that's available. And, and then there, all of a sudden we open up a new section to Area 18 and you actually see advertisements about its availability within the game, but done in a, in an in-fiction, type of device. And so, I like the whole mechanic. I would like to see more.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So let's see what else we have here. We noted that hospital gameplay was not on the roadmap to 4.0, and nor was the Endeavor Hope. When is the detailed medical design for the PU intended to be developed and implemented?
Can't comment on the Endeavor Hope right now.
Is that another when question? I'm so sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. How do they phrase it? The medical stuff actually is on the schedule. It's just that I classify it a bit differently. I classified that under rescue, and the reason for that is that we've said before that we don't really have the concept of occupation. You can do whatever you want. It just depends upon what your personal capabilities are, mm-hmm. and maybe if you have a ship that's actually compatible with trying to do that. But there's going to be, between occupations, there will be very gray lines, a lot of overlap. There's going to be a lot of commonality in terms of some of the things that you will do. And for example, if you think about rescue can involve anything from, there's a stranded pilot in a combat zone, his ship got blown up. So now, are you willing to basically go pick him up? Well, that may involve, if you want to do it, really particularly well, you need to be really adept with the dexterity challenges, inherent with using the tractor beam to pull a guy out of space as quickly as possible. Because if you actually stop and if you actually stop for an extended period of time, you're just going to be a bullet magnet for all of the other, combatants that are flying around in that space. So you could pick a guy up that's been, ejected from his ship. But another form of rescue would be administering, some sort of medicine to, an infected crew, to where you don't want to kill them and they're delirious and they're hostile. But so you need to subdue them and then, and basically give them an injection. In other words, you don't want to. You want to subdue them via non-lethal means so that you can administer the treatment, because ultimately they're just overcome with an infection and they're not bad guys. There may be other ones to where, well, you've got a space station and it's basically lost its shielding, it's falling into the sun, and basically there's smoke and flames everywhere, and they're looking for someone to just start dragging incapacitated scientists, get them onto the ship and get them back to get them back somewhere as quickly as possible. So these and many other things I would all classify under, well, it's all kind of medical / rescue. And so it just depends upon, well, when you classify things as occupations, I kind of break them down into maybe 8 or 10, big things, and then underneath those big things, there's a lot of different variety. Another easy example would be transport. Well, when you're doing transportation, or what are you talking about transporting? Are you talking about transporting commodities? Are you if you're talking about transporting commodities, you're probably on average going to have a larger ship. It's going to be slower. One of your primary challenges will probably be dealing with pirates that are drawn to the all that value that gets stored on board your ship. Another type of transport would be information, and we may use there will be a lot of overlap, but when you're talking about information, you can do that with any ship. And so we probably have some information challenges to where you need to get this information to there within a very short period of time. So you need a faster ship, ideally, to be able to do that particularly well. You may have some sort of biological, get a heart, from this, location, to that location. You may, if you need to basically transport, going back to the information again, it may be a stealth thing to where you need to get, the secret coordinates of, this to the captain, but he's basically, bunkered down, and, he's got, a bunch of assailants, outside of his base. And so somehow you need to sneak, stealth, whatever, through enemy lines to get that to him. So these are all kind of, well, I'm taking something from point A to point B, but they're dramatically different in terms of the challenges you could face. And some players will do everything that falls under the rescue thing. Other ones will be more interested in a narrow slice of these whatever you want to call these macro occupations. And so again, it's like I just don't,
That's
to
what you're
me, you need to be more specific than saying medical. It's like, well, what type of medical? Because we're going to have a lot of different ways by which you can help other players and other NPCs, so that it doesn't become, incredible. Again, this kind of goes back to, I just like a lot of diversity. I like a lot of variety, or else I tend to get bored.
Yeah.
And so if you want to keep players engaged for the long term, you need to present them with lots of different challenges. And of course, some will just say, well, I only want to do these two.
Right, you'll have your
but you're certainly going to have the opportunity.
Red pilots who just want to work in a med bay and heal people. You know what I mean?
And that's great, but there's going to be a lot of other people that are a little bit more broad in their definition. And they just want to help other players in need, and and they will have the opportunity to aid those other players or NPCs in a variety of different ways. And so really it just comes down to, we'll probably at some point put out something that kind of breaks these occupations down as to how we categorize them, and then that kind of like subdivides them into like all the sub occupations that we're going to be initially trying to support for any given point release.
Okay, awesome. So this is a question, it's a little bit long, so I'm gonna cut this one down a little bit. I saw quantum linking mentioned in the roadmap. Can you elaborate?
Quantum linking is really just it's a term I formulated to bring attention to the fact that we were going to have to deal with some issues on the back end. For example, when you are jumping from point A to point B, what's in between there exists only in probabilistic fashion within the game. We don't really have 100,000 NPCs being simulated on a server. That would just be prohibitively expensive and incredibly inefficient. So what we really do is we distill things down into into I've got a ringing in my
Who
ears.
even has that type of phone ringer nowadays?
So basically, assume you're going from from point A to point B, and something basically pulls you out of quantum travel. There's an interdiction device, or something comes across your path, whatever. So the question becomes, now that you've been pulled out, what about other members in your party? What about other friends? What about other parts of your escort mission? In other words, you may have accepted an escort, you may have agreed to escort a bunch of freighters, and they start to jump. 1 jumps, 2 jumps, 3 jumps. Meanwhile, you're engaged in a fight. Now, what it's going to do, what the system would normally do is, well, when you jump from point A to point B, it's going to roll the dice and figure out where for lack of a better term, where the quantum mechanical wave collapsed, and you encountered something right here, and then that takes form, and now that's where there's some new action. But now all of the subsequent guys that jump, that are associated with that mission, with that party, that are a friend, that have some sort of relationship, they need to basically fall out in that same place. And it's not as simple as saying, oh, well, everyone should just fall out when they're going between A and B at this point, because all of a sudden you just have a bottleneck to where you'd have 100 players, bing, 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 everybody's getting pulled out. And that's not really the effect that we want. But what we do want is to allow players that are, say, protecting a convoy of a dozen ships, and half of those ships that basically jumped, have already made the jump, and you haven't yet. When you jump, you should basically bounce to whatever location they have. Similarly, you may have players in a party. If your party member jumps and he encounters something, and you're finishing off the last guy, and then you jump 30 seconds later, you have to basically, you don't want to roll the dice, you don't want to roll those probabilistic dice like you would if you were a loner. What it really needs to do is basically figure out that there's someone quantum linked to you, and you basically need to adopt their reality as yours, and you're going to pop out at that exact same location.
So one of the follow-up questions was, does this mean that I can have 2 ships in quantum travel flying together at the same time, and you could jump out EVA from one ship to the other?
No,
I guess that type of velocity would probably kill you.
Yeah, it really doesn't. It doesn't imply anything in regards to that. The whole idea is still that now, when you're in quantum travel mode, you better have your doors sealed on your ship, and you better not be wandering outside of your ship, or you will
making coffee.
You will immediately die. No, the quantum linking is really just related to keeping groups of players and characters that have some sort of implied relationship. Maybe it may be an explicit relationship; they're members of a party, or they're friends, or it may be implied in terms of, well, they're part of the same. They're associated in terms of a mission or something. And some of those mission relationships, some of them may be quite formal, other ones may be informal. And so quantum linking is basically just it's really more of just a background term for us, but it needs to be done before we can do escorts particularly effectively.
Fantastic. Awesome. Well, I think we're just about out of time. So I wanted to give you guys a couple quick community updates before we sign off. First and foremost, a huge thank you to our subscribers for making shows like this possible, and also a huge thank you to all citizens who make Star Citizen possible. We could not do any of this without you. Now, today is Tuesday, which means tonight we will have a new lore post. Tomorrow, Wednesday, a new episode of Lore Maker's Guide to the Galaxy. Thursday, Around the Verse will be emanating from our Foundry 42 UK studio, and then Friday we'll be back here, Reverse the Verse. We'll be talking about everything that you saw on Around the Verse. So thanks again, Tony, coming out and hanging out with me. Let's do this again soon. We could easily do this all day. And
yeah, no, there's actually quite a few questions. I mean, we had to cull the list down significantly to get to there. We should actually keep, because there were some of these I actually did want to address during this time. We didn't have time, so we can just do it next one. Like in particular,
do you know one? If you have one, let's do it. They always get on us about not staying. You just keep going. Let's keep going. You got another one?
Well, yeah. There's the whole concept of long range scanning, and basically a little bit of that snuck out into the wild a couple of months ago. And as soon as it did, we basically have like a multi-review process here, and that one.
Where is that one? We're doing it live.
It was Eshatos' question.
Eshatos'. Oh, all right. Here we go. System and planet, we're in overtime, y'all. System and planet sizes, distances seem enormous. Once the scanning tech is implemented, how possible or impossible would it be for a player in Star Citizen to stay hidden in space or on a planet if they don't want to be found?
It should be quite easy, and the reason is long-range scanning, what we don't want is to basically have the magic button, you press it, and every player and ship type within an extended range is automatically visible to you. We also don't want to tie the ascertaining of where these other characters are to any sort of simplistic dexterity-based mechanic, and that was what I was kind of referring to before. It's where we had something get out in the wild a couple of months ago, and it just hadn't gone through all the levels of vetting, so we're actually heading in a different direction. Long-range scanning will be much more analog in nature, and what I mean by that is that it should relate to things like, I mean, in essence, you're going to have passive and active forms of scanning. Active, is more straightforward. You're basically, sending out some sort of signal. You're looking for reflections, etc. The downside is, of course, it basically gives away your position. The passive scanning is you're doing things like collecting, radiation, and we're going to borrow a lot of concepts from, just astronomy, radar, sonar, etc. We're probably going to wind up supporting the ability for players to analyze 3 different portions of the electromagnetic spectra. Those will be infrared, and each one of these areas will basically have pros and cons fairly similar to what you get in the real world. You'll be able to analyze the infrared spectrum, and the pros of that is that infrared radiation is not obscured by gas and dust, and therefore you can see right through clouds. It tends to be fairly low resolution. You're going to need to really be able to, you're going to need to be a true master of operating the cooling apparatus so that you can mitigate the effects of any sort of incidental radiation that could corrupt the imagery that you're going to be inspecting. We're going to allow you to inspect, obviously, the visible spectrum. That'll be where you'll tend to get your sharpest images. It's where it's easiest to basically get a quick image of what you're looking for, but of course it can be fooled fairly easily by ships just running dark with no source of light behind them. Then we're going to allow probably analysis of the X-ray spectrum, and this is where you're going to be able to pick up radiation that would emanate from things like shields, certainly energy, certainly the energy output from engines, weapons, stuff of that sort. And so this X-ray would probably give you the easiest ability to basically discern large ships, even at a distance. But it's also going to give you limited benefit in terms of identifying exactly what that ship is. And so we're also going to wind up giving you a few tools that we, just borrow the concepts from the real world in terms of, well, you'll have exposure time and field of view and things of that, things of that nature. And the idea is that you're basically going to be looking at a portion of the sky. And again, I'm just talking about the passive here, and not the active form of scanning. Looking at a portion of the sky, collecting radiation over a period of time, and then taking this inconclusive, data and using your skill, your experience to decide where there's something that you think is particularly notable, where you think that there's something that looks a little bit off, and basically training your apparatus to basically focus in, give you a little bit better view there. And once you basically zeroed in enough, allowed your equipment to basically extract enough information, then eventually your computer will actually wind up getting some sort of positive lock in terms of, oh, it's a ship of this type and it's moving at this velocity and yada, 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 yada. So the point is that long range, and again, I'm talking about long range, not short range scanning, it should be it should be a fairly intellectual exercise, and it should be something that is fairly difficult to basically know what's around you, especially when like I said, when there may be clouds of gas and dust that are obscuring things, or who knows what. And so what we're going to aim to do is basically make it a much more skill oriented challenge that's going to reward players that actually put in a sufficient amount of time to really learn what an anomaly looks like when you're looking at the infrared spectrum for this particular type of ship in these particular in these particular conditions. So it'll be much different, and I think a lot more ultimately fulfilling for people to master this type of stuff, as opposed to, again, it's like the really simplistic stuff that I tend to hate, which is press the button and everybody within 50 miles is now known to you. The real world doesn't work that way. I don't think the game should either.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, fantastic. And that about does it, guys. So thanks again. Thanks to everybody. Thanks to Tony. Thanks to the world. We'll see you guys in the verse.
Adios.